All right, we are stepping way off the beaten path today. We're venturing deep into the shadows to explore the dark and, honestly, pretty terrifying folklore surrounding some of India's most notoriously haunted villages. Throughout this explainer, we'll be breaking down accounts from investigators and locals that completely blur the line between local myth and a very, very chilling reality. So if you're ready to explore the unknown, let's just dive right into it.
So I want you to ask yourself, what actually happens when you step into a village where the living are the minority? It's a concept that totally upends our entire understanding of reality, right? Keep that specific thought in the back of your mind as we journey into our first location, because it frames exactly what one young woman experienced when she traveled up into the remote mountains of Himachal Pradesh.
Let's travel over to Bemwani village. A woman named Vartika headed up there to attend her friend's wedding. Sounds fun, right? Well, upon arriving, this beautiful, picturesque mountain setting morphed into an absolute nightmare. Almost immediately, Vartika witnessed a man repeatedly smashing his own head against a tree, bleeding everywhere, and the locals were just completely ignoring him. And guys, that was just the warm-up. During the actual wedding ceremony, the priest asked the bride to pour a little ghee into the sacred fire. Instead of doing that, she dumps the entire container, literally setting the priest's hand on fire. Suddenly, the bride's head starts whipping violently from side to side, her skin turns this pale, sickly blue, her face physically distorts, and she starts screaming in a booming, deep male voice in a language nobody recognized. Naturally, Vartika rushes forward to help her friend, but the possessed bride violently chokes her. But you know what the absolute most terrifying part of this whole ordeal was? The mother of the bride and the rest of the village just watched this happen. Completely unfazed, total apathy.
Now, you might be wondering, why on earth didn't anyone do anything? Well, it all comes down to the cultural context. According to local lore, Bemni isn't actually a village for the living. It's what they call a Pridnath, which literally translates to a city or domain of spirits. The locals firmly believe this specific land was historically allotted to supernatural entities, so the living were merely guests there. In Bemni, demonic possessions aren't treated as these terrifying movie-level anomalies. They're just a normal, everyday part of life. It's an expected hazard of living on cursed ground.
Because it's so common, the villagers handled the bride's possession with this wild, clinical efficiency. They had initially drawn protective boundaries of salt around the wedding house, which is a pretty common practice. But a tiny break in that salt line is all it took to allow an entity to slip through and possess the bride. Instead of totally panicking when she attacked her friend, the village elders just sort of waited it out. They called in a senior priest, not to perform some dramatic exorcism, but just to casually negotiate with the spirit. He literally just asked what offerings it needed to leave the bride alone for her big day. Once those demands were met, the spirit left, and the wedding just kept going as if absolutely nothing had happened. Crazy, right?
Okay, moving on to our next section. The Charred Desert Hut, an accidental encounter in Rajasthan. Leaving the mountains behind, we're heading into the arid, unforgiving landscapes of Rajasthan, where the supernatural takes on a much more deceptive form. The year is 2013. A senior political PR officer and his local driver are desperately trying to navigate through a brutal, blinding sandstorm. They'd been forced off their standard route because of a security alert, and now they're just completely stranded in the isolated desert. Hours go by, and suddenly their car stalls out. Through the swirling sand, they spot a mysterious figure dressed in traditional Rajasthani attire. This figure seems to be luring them toward a solitary, isolated hut off in the distance. Desperate for refuge and a little food, they decide to approach it. And this is where things get completely wild. What happens next exposes a terrifying duality. We have two men experiencing two totally different realities in the exact same room. The PR officer, he walks into a modest, really clean hut. He sits down, has some water, and peacefully eats a meal prepared by this warm, welcoming husband and wife. But the local driver? Oh man. He steps inside and is instantly frozen in absolute terror. Where the PR officer sees a clean home, the driver sees a blackened, charred ruin. And that kind couple serving food? To the driver, they look like burnt corpses with rotting, blackened skin, just staring intensely right at him. The driver was trembling, completely struck with a sudden, severe fever. He basically dragged the PR officer out of there without explaining a single thing until they finally reached safety. When they recounted this bizarre story to the local sarpanch, the village head, the dark truth finally came out. Years ago, an intercaste couple had eloped and built a little house in that exact isolated spot. But the local village council, the Khap, were so enraged by the union that they burned the couple alive inside their own home. What we're seeing here is this terrifying phenomenon of the unreliable narrator. The spirits essentially presented a peaceful illusion to the outsider who didn't know the land's history. But the local driver's deep connection to the area forced him to see the horrific, charred reality of the curse.
All right, let's turn to our third segment, Kuldara's Dark Curse, the village that vanished overnight. So, we've seen deceptive illusions, but now we're stepping into aggressive, violent horror. 1,000, that's a huge number. 170 years ago, a thriving community of over 1,000 Paliwal Brahmins lived in the village of Kuldara in Rajasthan. But in a single night, every last one of them vanished. Just gone. According to historical records, they fled to escape a tyrannical king who was demanding a local Brahmin girl. Rather than submit to him, they abandoned their ancestral home and took everything they could carry. But right before they left, they cursed the very soil, ensuring that no one would ever be able to spend a single night in Kuldara again.
And let me tell you, that curse absolutely holds true today. Even visitors who go during the daytime experience terrifying phenomena. A team of paranormal investigators went out to Kuldara with frequency meters, really hoping to document some hard truth. Well, they got it. The activity escalated so rapidly. First, these small, dusty child handprints started appearing all over their locked vehicles. Then, out of nowhere, they heard the distinct approaching sound of women's anklets, gungru, completely surrounding them, while their frequency meters were just spiking off the charts. But the climax? Pure violence. One of the investigators was shining a flashlight down into an abandoned dry well, and he was violently grabbed by a dark, distorted entity hiding inside the shaft. His friends literally had to physically drag him out of there. The attack left the guy with a severe fever, foaming at the mouth, and suffering from violent fits. The team had no choice but to immediately flee the village.
Let's move to our final story for today, the Churu entity encounter, searching for the paranormal.
Now, unlike the other stories we've covered in this explainer, where people sort of just stumbled into the paranormal, this final encounter involves investigators walking right into the lion's den on purpose. 13. That is the number of restless entities currently trapped inside this single, ruined courtyard home in Churu. The local villagers will literally avoid the entire street after sunset. The backstory here is just a massive tragedy of greed. 2 families, 13 people in total including kids, lived in this house. An instigating ant caused a massive, bitter dispute over the land, which eventually culminated in family members pulling out guns and slaughtering each other. Every single one of them died, and now all 13 entities haunt that property.
So, completely ignoring the warnings of terrified locals who absolutely refuse to go past the front gate, the lead investigator steps inside, and he immediately gets hit with this suffocating aura of depression. He described it as a sensory attack that made him feel like he might just drop dead from the sheer grief alone. Then the auditory stuff started. Coming straight from the ruined open-air kitchen, they clearly heard the chilling laughter of the exact ant who had instigated the fatal shootout in the first place. Trying to get away from the laugh, they fled into the courtyard and peeked into one of the pitch-black bedrooms. And there, just hovering in the dark, were 3 pairs of glowing, diamond-like eyes. It was the spirits of the deceased children hiding behind old steel trunks.
At this point, total panic sets in. They make a break for the exit, but it's blocked. Standing right between them and the safety of the street was a massive 6.5-foot-tall shadow figure dressed in a traditional dhoti. The villagers later confirmed to them that this was the uncle. He was the incredibly stubborn, aggressive man who actually fired the first shots in that family massacre. So, trapped between the laughing aunt, the glowing eyes of the kids, and this towering shadow blocking the gate, the investigators just made a blinding sprint for their lives. In the sheer panic and pitch blackness, the investigator crashed headfirst into the heavy iron gate, just barely managing to scramble his way out into the street. But, as we've learned, escaping the haunted house doesn't always mean escaping the nightmare. Almost instantly, the investigator was hit with this intense nausea, an actual physical reaction to an entity latching onto him. During the whole drive home, he felt a heavy, physical presence sitting right there in the backseat of his car. Terrified and completely sleep-deprived, he sought out his spiritual guru in Sonipat, but even after a cleansing ritual, the haunting followed him right into his own home. He started experiencing these awful midnight terrors, waking up to the feeling of air being blown directly into his face in the pitch black. To cope with the overwhelming dread, he'd just wander his house at midnight, obsessively watering his plants just so he could be near living, grounded things. And that brings us to one of the most chilling validations of this entire explainer. When the investigator finally called his guru in a full-blown panic, the guru didn't even let him get a word out. He just picked up and said, "You couldn't even say hello on the phone. I already knew what followed you home." The guru confirmed that the investigator had been followed all the way back by a 97-year-old entity from that Chiru house. It was a spirit so incredibly stubborn and aggressive that it had attached itself to him the literal second he stepped foot in that tragic courtyard.
So, as we wrap things up today, I want to leave you with this. From the cursed grounds of Bemni, where spirit possessions are literally just part of a Tuesday, to the deceptive desert illusions in Rajasthan, to the violently guarded ruins of Kaldara and Churu, are these all simply local legends, just stories born out of historical tragedies and human grief? Or is there a terrifying, unseen truth actually waiting out there in the dark? Think about that the next time you find yourself on a lonely road at night. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep your curiosity and maybe just a little bit of caution alive. Catch you next time.